to see the railway unions providing a film on the life of the railwaymen, the Transport and General Workers Union, one on the risks a motor driver takes from day to day providing transport for the people and goods. Indeed, the life of the great army of workers, builders, miners, seamen, printers, electricians should be dramatized, because their life and work's the stuff of which life is made.
Films can tell us a lot about their makers. What makes the cooperative movement's use of film so fascinating is its position as being both business and political. The founding father of the modern cooperative movement and socialism in Britain, Robert Owen, believed, quote, "Man should work to provide happiness for all, not to make profits for a few. Cooperation, not competition, is a better way of running industry and society. Poverty, starvation, the lack of a working class vote and voice. These were the reasons the cooperative movement were founded, and they aimed to give people the means to help themselves and others. This idea would first take shape in the form of a little shop in Rochdale. Founded in 1844, the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers proved that cooperation was viable in Britain. They fairly weighed their produce, tried where possible to always maintain its quality, and members of the store owned the store and would receive a dividend in proportion to what they spent. This model would be reproduced by others the country over, and by 1850, there were 130 cooperatives nationwide. It's fair to say their open stance against capitalism and industrial society scared no one at first. But when private retail stores saw they were losing customers to co-ops, they lobbied suppliers to boycott the movement. But by 1863, cooperation had grown so much that 300 individual co-ops were able to come together to form the CWS, the Cooperative Wholesale Society, that would become the major supplier to most co-ops. 5 years later, a Scottish version, the SCWS, would be formed, and together they would go on to eventually become what we call today the Cooperative Group. In the years that followed, the movement only grew. Cooperative factories and mills, cooperative farms, and a cooperative bank. By 1870, the number of cooperatives countrywide touched nearly 1,000. By 1890, the CWS had major branches in Leeds, Blackburn, Bristol, Nottingham, and Huddersfield, and factories in Manchester, Leicester, Durham, and Batley. By the time of World War I, they had major offices in the US, Denmark, and Australia, and a plantation in India. The 1890s also saw the birth of cinema, a technology quickly adopted by businesses the world over, and the cooperative movement was no different. As early as 1898, co-ops in the UK were already creating their own films. Like any art form, films reflect the time in which they are created. But as an art form, film started its life in a factory, and indeed, many of the first films made were of the factories of the Lumiere brothers. By 1914, nearly all of the CWS's own factories had been filmed for use in lectures.
But will there be any spinning for Jenny to do if this machine is all you claim?
Well, I don't know.
Education is a founding principle of cooperation, and lectures on the purpose and extent of the cooperative movement were regularly given for the benefit and education of their members. A key tool in these lectures was the magic lantern, a rudimentary form of slide projection. But since the 1890s, film had regularly been used alongside the magic lantern to show the movement in motion. An anonymous 1914 article in the Cooperative News would declare the magic lantern dead and charge cinema with being its killer. This article marked a shift in the movement's adoption of cinema and would foreshadow the importance the young art form would come to have. Quote, "We are the force that is capable of transforming the industrial and economic conditions into that state in which we would like to see them and know them and live them. When we think of what mankind should be and might be and ought to be." There would be the ship bringing the raw material into the canal siding, the wonderful grain elevators greedily devouring it from the hold of the vessels and carrying it to the capacious silos, and we could see it conveyed by marvelous automatic means to the machinery, see it being turned into flour, and see the flour being loaded for the retail store. We should not keep out humor. In fact, we would do with a little more humor in the cooperative movement. It would certainly not make us any less human, nor any less divine, nor less serious. Most co-op films were shown exclusively to members or would-be members, something criticized as preaching to the converted. The anonymous writer of the article saw that cinema could be used to influence public opinion and felt that more should be put into film development. But just how much film could influence public opinion was about to be discovered. A year after its publication, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation would become the first film to be screened in the White House. It was a nationwide sensation and would come to leave an influential mark on the history of cinematic style. But its depictions of the KKK as heroes of the South would aid in reforming the Klan, and reports have shown that lynchings increased in areas the film was shown. It told a revised version of the Civil War, painting the freedom of slaves as a danger to society. The co-op's history with the Civil War tells a different story.
The men of Rochdale have not lost their love of freedom and their love of truth. They will know that those in this country who pat the American slave owners on the back do so because they would like to be slave owners in England as well.
When the cooperative textile mills faced a devastating shortage of cotton, they held strong in their support of the North.
Mr. Ernest Jones is right. Great though distress is, greatly though we suffer through northern blockade, we co-operators and socialists, we working men of hungry Lancashire, declare our support for the North. Declare that slavery is an evil thing and must be ended.
A later spearhead of filmmaking at the London Cooperative Society, or LCS, the largest co-op in the world at the time, F.H.W. Cox would say, quote, "The weapons of progress and propaganda in the hands of our opponents are far superior to anything we possess. Until we stop being 50 years behind the times, and until we take advantage of radio, press, and films to the fullest extent of which we are able, we shall remain at the mercy of capitalism." Throughout the 1920s, we began to see the development of cinematic storytelling within the cooperative movement. It was considered by some that merely advertising the goods and services of the CWS and cooperative societies was in itself a political act, as it allowed the movement to grow. Another limitation was the lack of a central filmic body within the movement. Though the CWS often acted as a figurehead of British cooperation, it was not the sole driving force of its cinematic endeavors. Much of the movement's most influential filmmaking would come from individual societies and specific enthusiasts within them. Entering into the most political of decades, the 1930s, politically charged filmmaking within the movement began to build steam. The aforementioned F.H.W. Cox with the LCS was a key player in this scene. So too was Joseph Reeves with the Royal Arsenal Cooperative Society, or RACS, the second largest society in London, whose building insignia reads, "Each for all and all for each." To a lesser extent, there was also J.H. Poyser with the Long Eaton Cooperative Society, whose approach to filmmaking he once stated to be 80% of what the audience wants and 20% cooperative education and propaganda. His 1934 film on the production of milk had proven the effectiveness of filmmaking for the movement at reaching the public when milk sales over the following year increased. It was a time when public communication was key for the movement. They had grown so large that they had once again caught the ire of private trade. The controversial Lord Beaverbrook, owner of the Daily Express, took particular issue with the movement during this decade, ordering his paper to run piece after piece against them.
So don't gossip. Give service, not disservice.
You'll notice among these a 1934 article written by Lord Rothermere, owner of the Daily Mail, who used his own paper to provide support for the British Union of Fascists, an organization funded by the Nazis. Yes, The wave of fascism that was sweeping Europe now washed up on Britain's shores. Cooperatives in Italy and Germany had already faced restrictions, and there were those in Britain that wished to do the same. It was now that collaborative efforts among the societies needed to be undertaken, and in 1937, the Big Four Societies of London, LCS, RACS, South Suburban, and Enfield Highway combined their efforts into the London Joint Education Committee and committed to a 5-year plan of film propaganda. Each year, £1,000 would be put into producing a 20-minute film shot on 35mm stock, as opposed to the 16mm that most societies used. They had support from the Co-operative Party, who, founded in 1917, had partnered with the Labour Party in 1927, and later installed their first cabinet minister, A.V. Alexander. He would go on to serve as the First Lord of the Admiralty through the war, and would later become the first person to hold the office of Minister of Defense after Churchill and Attlee. Alexander strongly committed to the movement's film endeavors. In 1938, the committee produced Advanced Democracy, in which Alexander gave a speech in full. They followed that up the next year with the lesser-known Voice of the People. It was here that the torrent of war finally broke out, and the collaborative plan was halted. The movement remained undeterred in delivering its message. The LCS came swiftly with their first wartime film, The Rape of Czechoslovakia, perhaps the first cooperative film to be shown in public picture houses on the same basis as other documentaries of the time. Fresh on its heels, 1940 saw the release of The Home Front, a film that differed from the official messaging regarding the war. It took to charge the profiteering of shopkeepers and wealthy people hoarding food early in the war. It asked for a square deal and a square meal for all, and questioned what kind of country Britain would be post-war. In 1941, Clement Attlee would tighten the reins on labor filmmakers, warning that talk of a socialist post-war Britain would frighten off American support with the supply of arms. But the cooperative movement pushed ahead with its visage of the future.
Now look here, wait a minute. You all seem to forget that there's a war going on.
Upon the movement's centenary in 1944, despite being in the depths of war, the CWS took the opportunity to release Men of Rochdale. With a powerful budget of £15,000, the film was based around the founding members of the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers. It asked if they were satisfied with the vast progress of the movement in the last century, to which they boldly declared, the work was not yet done. Acting on that sentiment, the next year they released Song of the People. Tracking the working class history of revolt and revolution, it called for new collective action to change the face of Britain.
But it says song. Where's the song come in? In the noise that men make when they break their chains.
Outspoken and bold, Song of the People reflects the sentiment felt at the time. A time when people needed unity and change. War ended, and the Labour and co-op government won the election by a landslide. It was at this point in its storied 100-year history, upon the release of Song of the People, upon the victory of war and polls, that the cooperative movement of Britain reached its peak. By this time, there were around 1,200 retail societies with claim to nearly 10 million members, which collectively had hold of nearly 12% of Britain's retail market share. What followed was a colossal decline in the movement's size and influence. Whether from new social services reducing the reliance on their support, deindustrialization eating at their retail real estate, or the rise of commercialism and the supermarket, the movement began to shrink. Where before the war, CWS and the cooperative movement led retail trends, for the long stretch after it, they were left trying to follow them. From 1950 to 1979, 18,000 co-op stores closed, and many societies merged in an effort to protect themselves. A 1958 report recommended embracing commercialism and moving away from their focus on the working poor. Film units shuttered their doors under tighter budgets, and film production shifted to employee training and straightforward product advertising. But the cooperative is not made up of any one business. It is a movement, and a movement is built on an idea. So long as that idea exists, the movement exists. And so long as that idea is shared, the movement grows. Today, worldwide, the cooperative movement comprises 12% of humanity. 10% of the world's employed population are employed through a cooperative business. That's 280 million people. The UK has over 7,000 registered cooperatives owned by 17 million members. And yet, there is still more to be done.
A new hope will come to those entrusted with the task of making known the way to the new world, because its new appeal will go direct to the hearts and minds of people accustomed to be moved by the technique of the movie.
William Cooper, what have you to say?
I were a socialist. We socialists wanted to make a city of brotherhood, a city of light set on a hill for all to see, a city free from poverty, crime, and meanness. Is there such a city yet?
Not yet, William Cooper.
Then our work is not yet done.
Will you have your say on the future of cooperation?